Thank you for joining in. I know it's summertime and people will be traveling hither and yon. So don't feel that you need to, send your excuse note or get a doctor's note or anything like that. I understand that people are traveling. Sharon's traveling today too. And I guess she did send an email with our link. I just I just didn't get it in my Gmail account. But we're continuing to read Elaine Pagels. Just finished probably the most probably the most significant chapter for her was chapter 3. Remember in the 1970s when she's introducing this, the idea of referring to God in feminine with feminine metaphors or in feminine terms was quite outlandish for many people. I mean, in the 1970s, you know, we were probably early 70s. We're in the midst of the Vietnam War and, a very, very patriarchal type of American society that we're living in. Uh, but that's when this book came out. And it probably, I don't know what the early readership was like. I read this book in the 80s, I remember, um, during my seminary career. But it would be interesting to look and see what some of the early reviews of Pagels were when this book was published. But my guess is that there was probably though there would be excitement about the Nag Hammadi documents coming to light and also being interpreted or translated for people to read. I think the implications of these documents, especially with respect to the Gnostic Gospels referring to God in feminine terms, not exclusively, but certainly being way open, very open to the idea that God has a feminine aspect, would have probably rubbed some people in the wrong way. At this time, the Presbyterian Church was still divided between North and South. The Presbyterian Church USA and the Presbyterian Church of the US. My history on that is kind of sketchy. Uh, but we concluded that chapter 3, last week. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or reflections that maybe have descended upon you over the time that ensued between then and now?
Dan, I think to me, one of the most important things out of chapter 3 was the focus on androgyny. And, that is really interesting to cultural anthropologists.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
the, yeah,
Can you can you
and
say
to psychologists.
right, right. Well, we saw what Carl Jung was able to do with that as well. But can you say more about that, Denny, as an anthropologist?
Oh, just the idea of, um, you know, patriarchy versus matrilineal and hunting and gathering societies. Um,
Yeah,
gender separation of gender assignment of labor. But I think very deep awareness of, the mother role,
right,
uh, but not exclusively the mother role was very important.
right, right. Yeah, and introducing that into a highly patriarchal religious tradition was going to upset a lot of people. I mean,
And
particularly the Catholic Church.
and her observation about where the patriarchy had the strongest support was among the lowest classes, and as you moved up into the middle classes, that began to loosen up, a great deal.
Right.
Well, sort of.
No, but I think what you're referring to is when you get into Roman society, you start to see women having more opportunities for not so much leadership roles, but at least for individual advancement. There were women who were being educated and in the aristocratic societies of Rome. And that's why I don't I made the conjecture that, the Gnostic Gospels probably appealed to the educated class, because, well, first of all, their foundation in Platonic and Neoplatonic thinking, and second of all, that was the class that was already living in a very, what we might call, proto egalitarian. That's not even the right word, but where opportunities for women were stronger and greater, and were probably open to the philosophical idea of, well, of course, if God is the highest power, then God must encompass both male and female qualities. There is really interesting research that's been done on the Jewish tradition, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, that uh, many feminist scholars, beginning in the 80s, started to conjecture, started to reflect on perhaps originally there was a feminine aspect or a feminine consort to God, just like Baal and Asherah. It would make sense in the ancient Near East where you have these, original pairs of the deity, uh, that the Hebrew people would have probably been open to that idea, living as they were right in the middle of Canaan. But then over time, especially after the Deuteronomists got a hold of the texts, those references got pulled out and, you know, excised, you might say. And then for 2,000 years, they lay dormant in Nag Hammadi, and reintroduced in 1945. So, any other thoughts about the feminine aspect of God? Well, if not, our next chapter is one that really coincides nicely. It complements, you might say, the chapter we read in Paula Fredrickson's Ancient Christianities on early Christian persecutions. And specifically, the persecutions, Pagels is referring to those under emperors Nero, Domitian, and Trajan, all the way up to the time of Marcus Aurelius, which would have been about 177. So this is a time when Christians are beginning to stand up for their faith and to have a sense that, this is a faith that's worth dying for. And Pagel's argument is that the emphasis that we see in the later creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, Chalcedon, and others, on the importance of the bodily resurrection of Jesus, as well as the actual suffering, the bodily suffering of Jesus, has its source or may have an influential source in the suffering of the early Christian martyrs. That seems almost, passe to us because we confess every Sunday some form of the fact that we believe in Jesus, who suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified and died and was buried, and the third day he rose again bodily. Uh, but Gnostics had a completely different view of this, right? Remember, they're coming from a rather uh, dualistic Platonic worldview. And we might even say some of the Gnostics were what we might call qualitatively dualistic. Matter is evil and spirit is good. So when they reflect on Jesus, many were saying, "Oh no, this guy." The more extreme qualitative dualists were saying, "No, Jesus didn't have a body. I mean, that would be contrary to everything that we believe here. Jesus only seemed to have a body." And because he only seemed to have a body, he only seemed to suffer on the cross. Uh, and this was an early heresy, especially taken on by people like Irenaeus and Justin, uh, called Docetism, from the Greek word dokeo, meaning to seem, that Jesus just appeared to be human. Well, that flies in the face of everything that we know about Orthodox Christianity in the 20th and 21st century. But at the time, this was an open question because Jesus was God. And, remember, many Gnostics were saying that this world was kind of a secondary world created by a demiurge that really had no reflection or had no relationship with the higher God. So why would Jesus want to be part of this demiurge world? So many Gnostics were saying, oh no, Jesus was a spiritual being. And I think this was probably one of the biggest controversies in the church. And it also reflects um, how Greek philosophy tended to think about this versus how Judaism thought about what it meant to be a human being, right? We've mentioned this before. The Greeks believed that the essential self was the soul, which was trapped, as it were, inside the body, and that the soul must release itself from the body. And there are all kinds of variations on this. So I'm really creating a caricature here. Jews, on the other hand, thought that it was important if you were going to be a human being, excuse me, you were a body enlivened by a spirit, and then you became what was known as a human soul. So there is no essential nature apart from those two things coming together. When God breathes the breath of life into Adam, Adam becomes a living being. And remove the breath, there is no Adam. There's only body and the breath that has been removed. So this is why it's so important for the early church in its with its emphasis or with its trying to think of the right word, with the influence that Judaism had upon some of the early church fathers. It was so important to emphasize the bodily resurrection of Jesus because that meant that Jesus was real, not a phantom, not a spirit, or not a ghost or anything like that. That was essential to the faith. I believe in the resurrection of the body. Well, if that body is resurrected as a human being, then when it died on the cross, it must have also suffered as well. And we don't really have a strong sense of what the whole of Christianity was thinking about the suffering of Jesus. Uh, we know what later Orthodoxy was going to say, but we also have these Gnostic texts that say, no, that's contrary to everything that we want to believe. Jesus, as God, could not suffer, right? Because, let's fall into Greek philosophy here. If God is absolute and God does not change, and suffering happens to God, then suffering involves a lot of change, right? Uh, and there were some people who were saying when Jesus suffered on the cross, God suffered as well. And no, that's not right. Jesus as the man and the man incarnate, the incarnate God, he suffered, but God did not suffer. That was something called patripassionism. So this is really the essence of all of the controversies that happened in the first 3 or 4 centuries of the church. How do we put together the nature of Jesus as a man and as God? And are they mingled? Are they half and half? Are they two separate natures who remain completely separate from each other? Uh, these were very difficult questions. But at the heart of that is the suffering that takes place. Um, and we know that later on, Christians were going to recognize the importance of suffering as part and parcel of their faith in the early persecutions of the church. And this would cause a split between Gnostics and early Orthodox Christians. So Any thoughts about this? We're going to get into some pretty heavy theology here when we start talking about the creeds. We know that early on in the church, the Christians, especially in Rome, were singled out probably unfairly. Uh, but there came to be a tradition of, accusing Christians, scapegoating them for the problems that befell Rome. Remember what we read about in Paula Fredrickson's book, that Christians who refused to sacrifice to the emperors, refused to sacrifice in the civic temples or to uh, Juno, Jupiter, or uh, we're we're not really committing a religious sin per se, but we're actually being uh, a danger to the civic health of their community. Maintaining that proper relationship, that decorum between the divine and the civitas, the people below, was essential to the health and well-being of the community. And when Christians refused to do this, they it was a threat. They were seen as unpatriotic, right? Now let's compare this to what we know today, right? We're obviously not in a situation in the United States, at least, where Christians are being persecuted in the way that they were in the first and second century. But there are certainly some Christians among us who uh, refuse to bend the knee to what we know of as Christian nationalism. That they refuse to recognize this connection between God and country, and are uh, basically denying that whole reality that God uh, sheds his blessing on the United States. Um, I've been thinking so much of the connections between ancient Rome or the Roman Empire and our current political situation, and the fact that we have a gladiatorial arena being set up in the front yard of the White House, where on Donald Trump's birthday, June 14th, we're going to have basically gladiator fights. These uh, it's not boxing. It's not people with gloves, but these are people just going at each other, just tearing each other apart. Uh, this isn't that far from what we saw in Rome. What happened over time in Rome, however, and this particularly happened around the time of Trajan, maybe 160, 177. It used to be that um, the proconsuls or the governors of a certain area would have to pay gladiators to come, at certain civic events and put on these displays of power and put on these entertainment types of displays. Um, and that costs a lot of money. Trajan, however, made it legal for uh, these governors to use executions of prisoners for these events. So you have this very economic question that's being addressed here. Why do I need to pay a gladiator over here when I can just get a bunch of lions and a bunch of, you know, ne'er-do-wells or a bunch of civic traitors, i.e., Christians, and have a very cheap event, appease the masses, and all is well. So there were a lot of social and political and economic aspects that were going into the persecutions of these Christians. But it's all pretty clear that this began with Nero. Uh, we know about this through the writing of a historian by the name of Tacitus, who I don't know why, but I've just become very interested in his work. He was writing from about around the death of Domitian, around 98 of the Common Era, and up to about 117. But he's really recognized as the premier, on the ground historian of the Roman Empire. Um, and Tacitus makes a mention of in his, I think it's his Histories or Annals, one of those two books, of the situation with Nero. And Nero, who, imagine this, you have a very autocratic emperor who decides he just doesn't like the architecture of Rome, Uh, you know, we really need to have greater monuments to our great empire. So what we need to do is we need to clear out some areas where we can start to build greater marble edifices. And so the tradition goes is that Nero had somebody set ablaze the area of Rome, the poor area that consisted of primarily, well, of many Christians. And when it came to light that he may have started this fire, you would hear about Nero fiddling during the burning of Rome. Nero chose as his scapegoat Christians. Oh no, it's those Christians over there. They eat the flesh. They have all kinds of very outrageous rituals, and it makes perfect sense that they would set Rome ablaze because they hate Rome. Uh, and thus the die is cast pretty much, where Christians start to gain a reputation of being, well, actually traitorous is really the best word for it. So it's not so much the religious beliefs that were identified as being the problem. It was their inability or their refusal to participate in the civic life of Rome or civic life of whatever, area they were living in, and thus potentially bring down the wrath of the gods upon the people. That was Paula Fredrickson's thesis, and you might remember that. So any thoughts about Nero here or autocrats building arches and edifices and, dare I say, ballrooms? I Go ahead, Denny.
As long as they're 250 feet high, that's critical.
Right, right. That's true. Nero was, a lot of the Roman emperors were full of themselves, but Nero was especially full of himself and wanted Rome to be, or historians suggest that wanted Rome to be a monument to his greatness, right? Um, and so he burned Christians. He chose them as the scapegoat, and thus the tradition was fairly well established because of Nero's grandiosity. Any other comments about this? Well, if you are a Christian who's being persecuted, and remember, it's only about 100 of the Common Era, right? It's, of course, even when Nero was emperor, I think that was in the 50s. You might have to correct me on that. The Gospels weren't really in circulation as we know them today. There was a lot of oral tradition. We know that perhaps the gospel reference or document that is hypothesized called Q, which has a lot of sayings of Jesus, may have been in circulation. Uh, but I think what Pagels is hinting at here is this question: how much did the experience of Christians being persecuted in the early years of the church lend itself to the elaboration of an understanding of Jesus dying on the cross so that, it served almost as a paragon, a model to aspire to. And thus, in the writing of the Gospels, between 70 and 100 of the Common Era, the emphasis on the death of Jesus and the suffering of Jesus becomes all the more acute. Now, was that a part of the church in the early centuries? It's difficult to say. We'd have to, or in the early decades, I'm sorry, we'd have to look at what Paul has to say about that. And, Paul doesn't really talk about, he certainly talks about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, but doesn't elaborate the suffering as much. So, do you get what I'm saying about this thesis? I think Pagels doesn't establish it, in so many words. But I think if you're reading this text, if you're reading chapter 4 and you're reading carefully, you start to think to yourself, I wonder how this early experience of persecution helped to develop the focus on the crucifixion and the heinous suffering of the crucifixion that Jesus underwent. Uh, any thoughts about that? Comments? Well, we know that Jesus was crucified, and we have extra biblical historians making that reference. Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny does not refer to, Pliny in the second century does not refer to Jesus so much as the followers of Jesus and their desire to be, to be martyrs, to be persecuted, to confess over against the threats that Rome was providing. We know in the four Gospels that the suffering of Jesus is central. The crucifixion of Jesus is fairly consistent, at least through the three uh, uh, synoptic Gospels, and also in the Gospel of John, just the day on which Jesus was crucified differs. Um, and we also have a pretty good sense from both the Gospels as well as the historians, the Roman historians, on why Jesus was crucified. And it really refers to the what you might call uh, I'm trying to think of the right word, the Occam's razor of crucifixions. That is the simple way to ensure that Jews do not uh, brook the uh, uh, brook the control of Rome and bring about a mass slaughter, as often would take place, especially during some of the religious festivals of Rome. It's better that one man die than 100 or 200 people, who rise up in revolt at the behest or perceived behest of this one messianic figure. So the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the tax or the scribes are seen as uh, the enemies here who put Jesus to death or have Jesus put to death for expediency's sake. And it's that suffering that we read about. Now, as I have already mentioned here, we don't see any of that in the Gnostic Gospels because many of the Gnostics, they weren't really crazy about this idea that Jesus had a body. Now, remember, there are various types of Gnostics. There are some Gnostics who believe that Jesus was a spirit, just a spiritual being. There are other Gnostics that believe that, and I don't know why Pagels doesn't develop this. I know she must have known it at the time. But at this 50 years later, we know the variety of Gnosticism that were out there. There were other Gnostics that believed that Jesus was a spirit that inhabited the body of a human being, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, and that upon the crucifixion, that spirit removed itself from Jesus' body. So Jesus as God did not suffer, Jesus as man suffered. And it's absolutely essential to the Christian faith to recognize that Jesus incarnate suffered on the cross. And Pagels is going to try to explain this. Um, if we look at the Acts of John, for example, which is one of the Gnostic texts, hopefully you're getting a sense of just the variety of the texts that were found here. I mean, over 50, they all have various names. Um, Let me just read the Acts of John. This is the one that she spends some time elaborating here. Um, and I'm on page 72, right in the middle of the page. Yet, if the sources agree on the basic facts of Jesus' execution, Christians sharply disagree on their interpretation. One Gnostic text from Nag Hammadi, the Apocalypse of Peter, relates a radically different version of the crucifixion. And this is Peter speaking. I saw him apparently being seized by them, and I said, "What am I seeing, O Lord? Is it really you whom they take? And are you holding on to me? And are they hammering the feet and hands of another? Who is this one above the cross who is glad and laughing?" So Peter is watching the crucifixion. Apparently, Peter mustered enough energy to be at the crucifixion, unlike what the Gospels say, right? He's watching the crucifixion, he's watching the nails being hammered into Jesus, yet above Jesus, there is somebody who looks just like Jesus who's guffawing and having a great old time, right? Laughing at what is happening down here. The Savior said to me, I'll say the sentence again. Who is this one above the cross? That who is glad and laughing. And the Savior said to me, he whom you saw being glad and laughing above the cross is the living Jesus. But he into whose hands and feet they are driving the nails is his fleshly part, which is the substitute. They put to shame that which remained in his likeness, and look at him and look at me. So we have two Jesuses, basically. Now, later on, the theologians of the church were going to, absolutely get rid of this, right? This is crazy. But the Gnostics were okay with it because remember the reality that there is a reality that rises above this world of change. And it makes perfect sense that the living Jesus would be part of that world, the eternal, and not part of this world of change and suffering. And so, also want to read to you, and I'm sorry if this is laborious because you've read this, but it gives us a good sense of what people were saying, what Gnostics were saying about Jesus and how he appeared to them. And this is the Acts of John. It's on page 73 and 74. The Acts of John explains that Jesus was not a human being at all. Instead, he was a spiritual being who adapted himself to human perception. And then he has a narrative about the disciples seeing two different Jesuses while looking at the same one individual, right? I, John, said, "Which child?" And he answered me, "The one who is beckoning to us." So there are two disciples talking, and one says, "Hey, look at that child over there. They're the one who's beckoning to us." And I said, "This is because of the long watch we have kept at sea. You are not seeing straight, brother James. Do you not see the man standing there who is handsome, fair and cheerful looking?" But he said to me, "I do not see that man, my brother." So we have Peter and James, or excuse me, John and James talking to each other, and there's obviously seeing some object in front of him, but they're seeing a different person. Then they go on to shore to investigate. He appeared to me again as rather bald-headed, but with a thick flowing beard, but to James as a young man whose beard was just beginning. I tried to see him as he was, but he sometimes appeared to me as a small man with no good looks, and then again as looking up to heaven. Then John continues, I will tell you another glory, brethren. Sometimes when I meant to touch him, I encountered a material, solid body, but at other times, again, when I felt him, his substance was immaterial and incorporeal, as if it did not exist at all. Now, this doesn't give us a very clear sense of, what it is the disciples are experiencing. But compare this variation among the Gnostics to the variation that we see even in the Gospels, right? Think about the disciples in John chapter 20, where after Jesus' crucifixion, they're all huddled together in one building, one room for quote unquote, for fear of the Jews. They thought the Jews were coming after them. And Jesus walks through the wall, right? I mean, how often do corporeal substance, entities walk through walls? But it's in this very setting, right, that Thomas later comes in and places his finger into the body of Jesus. So we have ambiguity even in the Gospels themselves. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus sits down with two disciples on the road to Emmaus, breaks bread, and then immediately disappears. Well, there's obviously something mystical going on there too. Um, so we we see even in the so-called Orthodox Gospels this idea that the nature of Jesus is somewhat suspect, right? It's certainly different than the way that we live our lives, right? Did Jesus go to the bathroom, for example? Did Jesus ever have to eat? I mean, the Acts of John later go on to say that, yeah, I was walking on the beach with him, and he didn't make any footprints. You know, so much for that footprints analogy that you hang on your refrigerator. Um, anyway, thoughts about this?
Think I mentioned this last week or alluded to it, but to me, this is the same process that we go through now. The literal Jewish interpretation of Jesus' resurrection, even then, was hard for them to take. And so they started developing metaphorical explanations, and
Right.
they just couldn't accept the Jewish version that it was a fact. It happened, as Crosan points out, that a dead guy got up and started living again, walking around. Just
Hmm.
couldn't accept that. And, not for a bad reason.
Right.
It, it justifies all logic and everything that they knew. But when I say they, I don't want to overgeneralize, because one of the things that fascinated me about chapter 4, and I don't know, there might be an interesting anthropological slant on this, Denny, but um, you kind of get the impression that the agnostics really viewed the Orthodox as almost cult members, that they would go to the extremes of their martyrdom. You got
Right.
86-year-old
Saint
religious
Ignatius.
figures saying, "Take me to the lions." I mean,
Right.
it's, but the thing that's different to me is that, we think we're familiar with cultic practices, and we've seen everything from, Jonestown to David Koresh, all of these things. But those martyrs, if you call them martyrs, the people
Yeah.
who die for their leader, they know the guy. I mean, you could even say the same thing about the Nazis and Hitler. They know the guy. And we're talking about people that are generations away from the historical Jesus. And this is still the way that they behave. And I find that to be really kind of interesting and kind of an exception. Again, this is where Denny might have some insights to how people react to cults and how how extreme their response can be,
Right.
especially decades later.
Right. And what you were saying, that remember what Fredrickson said, there were some Christians who just said, no, I recant my faith, but then just went on never feeling like they really did anything wrong. But there were others, and I would suggest they were most likely part of the lower socioeconomic class, though not exclusively. But we know that there were martyrs who were military people, and uh, there were several aristocratic women, but most of them were like this Blandino was a slave,
Yeah.
and wanted to demonstrate the extent of her different different type of aristocracy, right? She had a spiritual aristocracy that was not going to um, cow her before the Romans. Um, it is really interesting what you're saying about that, and also what Fredrickson's saying about. But there were some, and I would suggest they were probably more of the Hellenistic Jews as well as Gentile converts who just said, "Oh yeah, yeah, I'll sacrifice to I'll sacrifice to the local god, no problem," and then they just went on their happy way. And there's a certain logic to that, right? So I I have 40 years ahead of me. I'm not talking about myself, but if I recant, or if I don't recant, they're going to kill me. And think of all the good that I can do in the 40 or so years that I have yet to live. But I'm going to just simply give it all up. And this is what made Marcus Aurelius so it really hated the Christians. It's like these are stupid people. They they they're doing something. Aurelius being the Stoic, uh, they're doing something that just makes no sense. There's no value to this giving up of your life of suicide like this.
Haven't you
And
people
so,
heard of crossing your fingers when you say something?
yeah, yeah, right. But Mac, you had asked Denny something, and I wanted to honor that too.
I just wondered how unusual it was to see this kind of cultic kind of following, and extreme um, ability to martyr yourself so far after the advent of the leader.
Mhm.
Uh, Mac, my only experience with the literature on this is uh, pre-agricultural societies, to put a different twist on it, sent deviants into the beyond the pale, if you will, beyond the
Like Cain.
beyond the thorns, that protected, a village, and sent them off to deal with the lions in a different way than the Romans did. And the lions loved it. I mean, it was it was a terminal treat for them. I mean, for the deviants,
Yeah.
because they had no defense, once
Right.
they were separated. So Mac, I don't know, but uh, you know, agricultural societies, after 10,000, you know, CE or BC, no, CE. Uh,
BCE. Yeah.
yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. That raises an interesting question. I mean, did what the Romans do, was there some sort of genetic memory that reflected this, pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer society, Because it's essentially the same thing. They just have the lions corralled in the Colosseum, uh, and they can make a spectator sport out of it. You know, because basically you're saying they're doing the same thing, sending them off to their certain death. Yeah, interesting. Any other comments or questions that you might have?
My guess is, if you go back far enough in history, that the Romans were, probably more descendants of from India and Persia, the Aryan,
Hmm.
if you will, not the Nazi, but the
Right.
Persian Aryans, and probably really looked down their nose on people of color coming across the Sahara.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Well, whatever the case, we have developing two ways of understanding Jesus. We know that we inherited a lot of the bodily imagery of the Orthodox. We think about Jesus having been born, uh, though he was born in a highly unlikely spiritual way of a virgin, but it was a birth, right? And he made references to the Eucharist as his body, and we have the emphasis on the bodily resurrection and Thomas placing his hand in the side of Jesus. And then you have this whole beautiful 14 verse hymn at the beginning of the Gospel of John, one of the later Gospels being written, about God becoming flesh and dwelling among us. I mean, and then that reflected also in the Philippians passage about Christ who counted equality with God as not as something to be exploited, but took on the form of a servant, emptied himself and took on the form of a servant. So, we're inheriting quite a bodily tradition, but there's still that gospel ambiguity that we see Jesus walking through walls and disappearing and doing strange things that most humans don't do. And then we have the so-called heretics on the other end of the spectrum, the Gnostics, who are sticking with what might rightly be called a Platonic dualism, whether that is an dualism that made the natural world evil or just made the natural world something that was less than desirable. The idea was is that true reality lay in the realm of forms, the realm of ideas, or in the spiritual heavens, right? And that Jesus really had nothing to do with this world below. And so they cannot imagine Jesus suffering bodily. Um, we see, of course, the insistence that later is developed in the creeds. And remember, the creeds are being, we talk about the Apostles' Creed going all the way back to the time of the Apostles, but most likely it did not develop until much later. And we look at the Apostles' Creed, we look at the Nicene Creed, and when we even look at Chalcedon, the Council of Chalcedon, which happened in the fifth century, um, trying to explain, excuse me, trying to explain the two natures of Christ and how they belong to each other, that they're not separate from each other, but they're not intermingled with each other. The Apostles' Creed says, Jesus suffered. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, placing him historically in, that context. The Nicene Creed, the same thing, the emphasis upon the bodily incarnation of Christ. So why this insistence? And this comes back to what Pagels is trying to say, that the early persecutions needed to have this idea of Christ suffering bodily, of Christ actually breathing, bleeding, not breathing. I didn't say that. Okay, I'll try to get Christ actually bleeding and Christ, uh, moaning on the cross, calling out, forgive them. They know not what they're doing, and just excruciating pain. The kind of thing we still see in, the whatever Mel Gibson's movie was, the Passion of the Christ, right? This idea that, this suffering is worthwhile, and if I suffer, I'm also more a part of Christ than anyone or anything, right? Because he and I go together. So during the early persecutions under Nero, for example, Domitian, um, who and Trajan in 98 to 117 or so. Trajan was the one who really tried to take a mediating position. He said, don't go seeking them out, don't go on a witch hunt. But if they are presented to you, then put to them the question: are you a Christian? Are you willing to sacrifice to the civic gods? And if not, then they get their reward, so to speak. And Marcus Aurelius, those were basically the four emperors who did a lot of the persecutions. And they give us, accounts, and we have accounts of, either from the Roman side or from the Christian side of people who would endure those sufferings, that suffering. For some reason, I have the word conspirators here, and I don't know what I'm referring to on page 76. Oh, I thought this was important. Remember how Nero would create the idea that Christians were scapegoats. And, there were some Roman emperors who saw, like then, this seems to be rather extreme, and they would give Christians the opportunity to recant, Uh, but in order to justify these heinous deaths, they would usually appeal to four different justifications. And I'm reading on page 76. The Christian group bore all the marks of conspiracy. First, they identified themselves as followers of a man accused of magic. Uh, Again, the magic of turning water into wine and things along those lines. Excuse me. Um, and executed for, I'm sorry. First, they identified themselves as followers of a man accused of magic and executed for that and for treason. Second, they were atheists who denounced as demons the gods who protected the fortunes of the Roman state. Now, that's Frederickson's argument. Um, Even the genius of the divine spirit of the emperor himself. Third, they belonged to an illegal society. Besides these acts that police could verify, rumor indicated that their secrecy concealed atrocities. Their enemies said they ritually ate human flesh and drank human blood. Well, if you remember anything about medieval history, this reminds us a little bit about the same kind of scapegoating justifications that were leveled against the Jews in the Middle Ages. They need the blood of Christian children to make their matzah for Passover, for example. So I'm going to leave it at that. When we come back, we're going to be on around page 82 or so. And if you haven't read it yet, reading some of the sufferings of Blandina, Saint Blandina, are 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 kind of, I don't know what the right word is for it, but it's a woman who in her frailty is able to maintain, is able to stay alive through all kinds of uh, executions. She's gored by a bull. Uh, she goes through all kinds of persecutions and still maintains the ability to praise God in the midst of this. It's a hagiography. It's really what it boils down to. So, any last comments before we move on? I appreciate the conversation today very much. Uh, keep keep those cards and letters coming, as they say. So, when we return, we'll probably pick up around page 82.
Don't
Okay.
change that dial.
Yeah, yeah. All right. See you later, everybody.